When a TV series runs as long as SpongeBob SquarePants, it's basically a given that a few episodes will be made as direct sequels to previous episodes. But when it comes to a show like SpongeBob that relies heavily on such things as negative continuity, which I spoke about at length in another video, which you can find a link in the description to in case you don't know what that means, there is a right and wrong way to go about it, as modern SpongeBob's attempts at sequel episodes have notably been very hit or miss. And today, I'd like to go over a few SpongeBob episodes that were made as sequels to older episodes and demonstrate what they did right that others did wrong. And obviously, there will be spoilers for plenty of SpongeBob episodes ahead, so if there's something you haven't seen yet but plan to, you should really keep on the lookout. You have been warned. Okay, so simply put, the best SpongeBob sequel episodes are the ones that don't rely on the fact that they are a follow-up to an earlier episode like a crutch and aren't afraid to be their own thing. And though it's not a sequel episode per se, one of the earliest examples of that is Fear of a Krabby Patty, which uses the same premise as Graveyard Shift in that it centers around the Krusty Krab being open 24 hours a day. But many both at the time and now are notably willing to forgive the similarities because the plots go in completely different directions, with the first centering around Squidward scaring SpongeBob after it gets dark, while the second is about the realistic consequences of the Krusty crew staying up for weeks on end, and Plankton taking advantage of that to try and get the formula. So while the starting point may be the same, they ultimately tell totally different stories to their mutual benefit, and the same applies to episodes that are more direct sequels to previous ones as well. And to give a good example of that, Season 13's The Salty Sponge is actually a pretty funny follow-up to No Weenies Allowed, because while the original is about SpongeBob trying to get into the roughest place in town only to be stopped at every turn by the bouncer, this episode completely flips the script. Because here, SpongeBob is forced to work at the Salty Spittoon and wants no part of it, knowing dang well that he's out of his element. But finding that he has no choice, he ends up getting declared the toughest guy in the place due to a series of misunderstandings. And with that title comes the privilege of doing anything he wants, and the patrons going along with it without question. And since this is SpongeBob we're talking about, he naturally turns the place into the most cute and wholesome hangout imaginable, to the utter bafflement of some out-of-towners looking for a good fight. And again, not only is the idea of SpongeBob taking a bar full of tough guys and turning it into a cutesy place of love because he was mistaken for being tough is funny on its own, but what makes it work even better is the fact that it doesn't beholden itself to the earlier episode and isn't afraid to be its own thing. Because if it had shoehorned in Reg, or had SpongeBob determined to prove his toughness again instead of getting the title by total mistake, then it wouldn't be nearly as funny. And indeed, just contrast this with Season 16's episode Squidward's Tough Break, because here, it's only the Salty Spittoon and its patrons to serve as a callback to No Weenies Allowed, with pretty much any generic tough guy character being able to fill Reg's role. Again, in the earlier episode, the fact that it was the Salty Spittoon that SpongeBob has to work at worked because it served a purpose beyond being a callback, as it makes it even funnier when SpongeBob is both mistaken for a tough guy by the patrons and turns the place into a cuter spot than Weenie Hut Jr.'s. But in Squidward's Tough Break, there's no reason for the Salty Spittoon to be part of the plot except that it's a reference to an older episode, and if anything takes away from it because these are pre-established characters, and the audience knows Reg isn't such a big jerk, for example. Though there's also the fact that Squidward losing his memory and becoming a biker isn't the greatest idea on its own, but it probably would have worked better had it not tried to rely on a previous episode as its selling point and had more confidence in its premise. Or for another example of this, the season 11 episode Doodle Dimension is actually a very good callback to the episode Frankendoodle, and was frankly the perfect way to bring back the character of Doodlebob, because while the original is about the hijinks involved after SpongeBob and Patrick get their hands on a surface world pencil that can bring anything they draw to life, only for things to spiral out of control when one such drawing goes rogue, Doodle Dimension places SpongeBob and Patrick in an alternate reality where there's nothing but themselves and a white void, though they quickly realize that they can draw things to fill their new environment. Now, there is of course the question of why SpongeBob had the pencil in his body, but that aside, that's actually not a bad idea for an episode on its own, but what makes it even better is the reason for Doodlebob's return, because rather than having him just show up, Patrick draws him while trying to say he misses SpongeBob, because in true Patrick fashion, he forgot that he's standing right next to him, and from there it becomes a doodle match between the two SpongeBobs. So again, not only does the premise actually accommodate the fact that it wants to bring back Doodlebob, but also does it in a way that makes sense. And as I noted before, the fact that it barely makes mention of Frankendoodle and instead lets the episode stand on its own merits is a major reason why it works, because it's another episode with Doodlebob, but doesn't rely on what he came from like a crutch, instead using the character and his unique circumstances to tell a different and equally interesting story, while also serving as a love letter to the older episode. And similar to the Salty Sponge, this can be contrasted with another season 16 episode, Curse of the Were-Doodle, because unlike Doodle Dimension, which took great pains to explain and justify Doodlebob's return and the ensuing Doodle War that takes place, in this episode Doodlebob just shows up for no reason, with how he came back never being explained, and the characters both acknowledge that they remember the events of Frankendoodle, but for some reason are much more civil towards him. And Doodlebob is also revealed to have a wife somehow. To put it simply, not only was this a sequel episode when it didn't need to be, but the fact that it is doesn't even make sense. Because if you were to watch the two back to back, the only thing anybody would be is confused. Now, unlike Squidward's Tough Break, the idea of a SpongeBob-style take on a werewolf where SpongeBob turns into a mischievous creature at the full moon could have worked, but it frankly would have been better if it had foregone Doodlebob altogether and had it be for another reason that he ends up transforming. Because again, the only reason it's Doodlebob is so it can be a sequel to the episode Frankendoodle, but the results do not work, unlike in Doodle Dimension. But this is perhaps most evident with Season 14, as about half the episodes in it were made as sequels to classic SpongeBob episodes in order to celebrate the show's 25th anniversary, only most of them didn't turn out so well. And again, the biggest reason for that was because they tied themselves too closely to the episodes they were trying to emulate. Like for example, Squid Idiot Box wasn't too well liked because many felt it missed the fundamental idea behind the original episode, which was that there was nothing special about the box and it really was SpongeBob and Patrick's imagination that caused all the noises. But here, the box is instead portrayed as a portal to some kind of imagination world that Squidward gets stuck in, and it just doesn't really work. I mean, the idea of Squidward getting stuck in a place where whatever he thinks happens and SpongeBob and Patrick accidentally planting unpleasant thoughts in his head sounds pretty funny on its own, but the fact that they tied it back to an earlier episode is frankly the reason why it fails to deliver. And a similar thing can be said about PL143, which misunderstands the original episode SB129 to such a degree it's not even funny, and may just be one of the worst episodes of the series because of it. Though the fact that they brought in stuff from that terrible spin-off doesn't do it any favors either. But I already spoke my piece on that in another video, which you can also find a link in the description too. Frankly, out of all the sequel episodes to come out of season 14, Mooned might actually be the best among them. Not necessarily for anything notable it does, but because of what it didn't do. Because unlike most of the other episodes that rely on their sequel status to carry the entire thing, Mooned is not afraid to be rather different from I'm Your Biggest Fanatic, with the idea of a moon jellyfish being so elusive that most doubt its existence, and being an allegory for the moon landing actually being pretty interesting. And not to mention, unlike the previous examples mentioned, this episode actually gets the fundamental nature of Kevin's character, being a supposedly great guy with a huge ego until the second things get serious, at which point he buckles and reveals himself to be a total fraud and coward, because that's exactly what he was in the original episode, and he stays that here, with the episode even adding on to this by retaining the fact that the jelly spotters finally saw through him and kicked him out for good, and how he's reduced to a pathetic mess without anybody to prop him up. Now sure, the fact that SpongeBob goes back to worshipping him even after he learned at the end of the original episode that he shouldn't be so quick to idolize people is a bit weird and contradictory, but I never said the episode was perfect. Because I'm not trying to argue here that the results are fantastic or anything, just that it's better than its competition, both because it actually understands the original episode and isn't afraid to do something different. Because again, the results may not be perfect by any means, but at least the episode is reasonably believable as a follow-up to I'm Your Biggest Fanatic and actually has something new to offer. Though, as I already mentioned, the fact that the episode understands Kevin so well is probably its saving grace, especially his backstabbing SpongeBob at the end and trying to take all the credit for catching the moon jellyfish, because that's exactly what he would do. It doesn't matter that SpongeBob did most of the work, gave Kevin back his self-worth, and believed in him when nobody else would. Because in the end, Kevin is simply a selfish jerk who only cares about himself and what will make him look good. And the fact that the episode is willing to embrace the full extent of his ingratitude after everything SpongeBob did for him alone makes it one of the better sequel episodes. Because like I just said, rather than walk back on his initial characterization and show that he isn't such a bad guy after all, or turning him pure evil for the sake of comedy, it ultimately embraces his true nature by having him do exactly what the character in the original episode would do, and be portrayed as both pathetic and unrepentantly selfish. Though on that topic, Blood is Thicker Than Grease isn't too bad as a sequel to Plankton's Army either, if only because it once again actually tells its own story and doesn't make its connection to the earlier episode too obvious. In the end, it has its own premise to stand on, and barely any recycled jokes from the earlier episode. So while its being a sequel to Plankton's Army may ultimately be minimal, that actually ends up working to its benefit because that allows it to stand on its own merits a lot more. And as I pointed out at the beginning, that's the common denominator here, that all of the better sequel episodes are the ones that distance themselves from the original and tell a completely different story with a similar idea or characters, while the ones that follow the original more closely usually end up falling flat. And another good example of this is Biscuit Ballyhoo, which serves as a sequel to Season 11's Goons on the Moon. Now, some complained that this episode was too close to Chocolate with Nuts, but in actuality, the two don't really have anything in common, as the episode centers around a competition between Sandy and Mr. Krabs on who can sell more biscuits. Now, similar to Mooned, the results aren't the greatest sequel episode ever, but what majorly helps it along is how utterly different it is. Because Goons on the Moon was about the science scouts going to the moon and the various hijinks that ensue, while here their goal is to go to Mars, but they don't even end up there until the final scene, with the entire plot centered around getting there by selling biscuits. And this allows the two episodes to be connected while having completely different and funny gags, with Mr. Krabs inflating Squidward's eyes in a vain attempt to make him look cute or probably taking the cake, similar to Squidward meeting his own voice actor in the original episode. It's the fact that they're similar, yet totally different at the same time, that allows both to work independently. Though if we're talking about great SpongeBob sequel episodes here, the best among them might just be My Two Crabs, especially because it probably wasn't even meant to be a sequel episode, yet ends up feeling like one nonetheless. Because simply put, this may not be the first episode since Krusty Love to show Mr. Krabs and Mrs. Puff in a relationship, but it is the first to have that once again be the main focus, and it does not let it go to waste. Frankly, one could watch the two back to back, and the only two things that would feel off would be the different animation style, as well as why SpongeBob isn't angry at Mr. Krabs anymore. And even that's understandable, as some time has clearly passed between the two. But other than that, this episode works perfectly as a follow-up to the original, because it honestly has a plot to match the likes of the earlier Krusty Love, with SpongeBob and Patrick believing that Mr. Krabs melted and stuffing his shell with chum that they subsequently bring to life, having no idea that the real Mr. Krabs was simply tanning and now doesn't have any clothes, and the ensuing chaos between the two Mr. Krabs, as well as everybody treating what is clearly not Mr. Krabs as the real deal, until it's spelled out in black and white who's who, makes for a really funny premise. Because again, not only is this something that one could actually picture coming out of the golden age of SpongeBob, which was probably helped by the fact that it was written while Steven Hillenburg was still alive, but it uses the earlier episode as a starting point to tell its own funny story with a similar setup, rather than following the original more closely, which wouldn't have been nearly as humorous as what we got. It both understands Krusty Love, yet isn't afraid to be its own thing, and the results are a hilarious blend of old and new elements that all SpongeBob sequel episodes should strive to achieve. So in the end, the point here is that the best SpongeBob sequel episodes are the ones that aren't afraid to be different from the original and are able to stand on their own, divorced from their predecessor. Frankly, the same could even be said for the theatrical sequel, Sponge Out of Water, but I already argued for that movie's merits in another video, which you can also find a link in the description too. Basically, it all comes down to that old debate of fan service versus substance, because all the examples I've gone over prove when any given episode understood the original and just tried to focus on being funny, the results were usually a lot better than using stuff from older episodes just for the sake of it, because that works best when there's a reason for it beyond fan service. And that was only just covering the basics. There are plenty of other examples I could go over, but I think I've made my point already. That SpongeBob may not be known for its continuity, but when it does choose to embrace previous events, it's better off doing it to as small a degree as possible. Okay, that's everything I wanted to cover. So now give me your thoughts on this. Do you believe that SpongeBob sequel episodes are better when they try to distance themselves from the original and aren't afraid to be their own thing? Or do you disagree and think that the best follow-ups were the ones that embraced their predecessor to a large degree? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below, because as always, you don't have to agree with anything stated in this video if you don't want to. You can feel about this or any other topic we discuss here that you'd like, and I nor anybody else can tell you you're wrong. And thank you all for watching. It is all very appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.